Today I'm going to talk about the book Silence, written by the Japanese writer Shusaku Endo. In this book, he explores the question of why is God silent when his people are being persecuted. He follows a story from 17th century Japan where the samurai from the Shogun Empire were persecuting the Catholics and especially the Jesuit priests that were in Japan. Um, what got me interested in this book is that Martin Scorsese has made a movie called Silence, which is based on this book. He purchased the rights to make the movie back in 1989, and this book is something that he's found very influential in his own life, and so he's been waiting to make the perfect movie of this book. Um, and having read the book, I can see why this book is close to Scorsese's heart, given the trajectory in how he's done his movies, and the question of suffering keeps recurring in different movies within a religious context. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about some philosophical themes that emerge in this book that speak to deeply existential situations that we face, without giving too many spoilers about the exact story. So, the existential question of suffering and where is God when we suffer is something every human being faces in whichever context they are in, whether they are being explicitly persecuted or not. Which is why I think this book and the movie is very relevant to the human condition. Um, so the first theme that comes in the book is, why is God silent when Christians or people that are followers of him are being persecuted? In the story, what happens is the Jesuits from Portuguese hear that one of their eminent fathers, Father Ferreira, has apostatized under the persecution of the Shogun samurai. So to apostatize means to renounce the faith. So when this news comes back to the Portuguese Jesuits, two of them say this could never have happened. Father Ferreira is the best man ever. He's a good father. He would never have apostatized. Something wrong should have happened. So they go into Japan to see what really happened to Father Ferreira. Is it just a rumor that he apostatized, or did he really apostatize? And if he did, why did he do that? So that starts the quest of the story. As Rodriguez and his fellow mate Father Garp, both of them go into Japan, they have to face the same persecution that Ferreira faced. And they have to face the same silence of God when Catholics are being massacred by the shoguns. So the question becomes, why is God silent? What do we do with the silence of God when his followers are being persecuted for their faith? As Father Rodriguez goes into Japan and he ministers to the Christians there, and he finds the Christians that he ministers to being persecuted, it raises for him the question of, is God really there? If God is going to be silent when his followers are being persecuted, is he really there? As he wrestles through this question, he realizes that he has two choices. He either has to say, no, there is no God, in which case he has to face the consequences of there being no God, or he has to posit a God and live life within that context. And he realizes that if he were to posit no God at all, then he is faced with the cruelty of meaningless living. what Shusaku Endo does brilliantly in the book is, at different times, he brings in the question of God's silence, and at the same time, in the book, he focuses on the sounds we hear. Hearing the sound of turtle doves, hearing the sound of fleas buzzing around. And in the sense, what he does is he brings to fore the question of, yes, God is silent, but then we still hear sound of different things from nature. And as Father Rodriguez goes through this existential question, what he realizes is that if he were to posit that there were to be no God, then the cruelty would be that all the sounds that he hears from nature that are beautiful, from the sound of the waves to the sound of the turtle doves to the sound of even the flying, the buzzing bees, they all become meaningless. And that world in which all these sounds lose their deeper meaning is a deeper cruelty than having to suffer for a reason. So that's a sense of insightfulness that Father Rodriguez comes to as he's having to face persecution himself and the possibility of dying for a God who he doesn't hear from. As the story goes on, Father Rodriguez realizes that the shogun samurai are a lot more sophisticated about how they go about persecuting people. The goal of the shogun samurai is not just to get the Christians to apostatize. The goal of the shogun samurai is to get Father Rodriguez to apostatize. Because if you get Father Rodriguez to apostatize, then the religion itself gets delegitimized. And the way the shogun samurai go about trying to accomplish that is by executing the Christians that are there in order to force Father Rodriguez to apostatize. If he wouldn't apostatize, then they'll continue killing the Christians in Japan. As he's facing this plight, Father Rodriguez has many questions. So how does he navigate through this? What does it mean to be a Christian in this context? Does he apostatize in order to save the life of other Christians, or does he stay true to the faith because that is what it means to be a follower of God? As he's facing this suffering, the one thing that is the North Star that helps him focus, that helps him make his journey all the way through, is meditating on the face of Christ. Shusaku Endo does a good job of explaining the external situation of what's happening and how that's affecting Father Rodriguez's internal thinking, and how Father Rodriguez's internal thinking affects his perception of what's going outside. So, as Father Rodriguez faces greater and greater persecution, he finds himself meditating more and more on the life of Christ. He finds himself thinking about the face of Christ. How did Christ look like when Christ himself was going through the suffering? How did Christ look like when he was in preaching the Sermon on the Mount? And this is an important point because a key essential foundation for the Ignatian way of spirituality is the meditation on the Gospels. When you meditate on the Gospels, you meditate on the face of Christ. You think about the countenance of God being in front of you. And it is that overwhelming countenance of God being in front of you that gives you the courage to face the persecution that you face. So as Father Rodriguez goes through this journey of facing greater and greater suffering in the hands of the shogun samurai, he goes into a deeper and deeper relationship with Christ because of his meditation on the suffering of Christ, with a focus on what the face of Christ looked like as he went through the suffering. What makes this interesting from a literary standpoint, and how Shusaku Endo has put this together, is that for the shogun samurai to get the Christians to apostatize, they had a ritual. And the ritual is they would place a metal sheet that had the face of Jesus imprinted on it, and they would have the Japanese Catholic person come and put their feet on the face of Christ. So if they would go through the ritual of putting their feet on the face of Christ, then that it's considered that they have apostatized and their life would be spared. If they would refuse to put their feet on the face of Christ in this metal plate, then they would be considered as Christians who refuse to apostatize, and so they would be killed. And what makes this interesting is, as Father Rodriguez finds himself meditating more and more on the face of Christ to give him courage to face the suffering, he also has to ponder whether or not he's going to put his feet on the face of Christ in this metal plate in order to save the other Japanese Christians, or if he's going to refuse to do that. That's the central dilemma that Father Rodriguez faces. To make it more interesting, the person that helps, that becomes the metaphor for this central dilemma, is a person called Kichijiro. Kichijiro is a Japanese guy who was a Christian, and then he apostatized, and then he became a Christian again, and then he apostatized. So he's a Christian that considered himself a Christian when things were going well, but anytime the shogun samurai would come and ask him to apostatize, he would go back and apostatize. He would betray other Christians. He had betrayed Father Rodriguez himself on different occasions. In fact, Kichijiro is the Christian who actually helps the shogun samurai apprehend Father Rodriguez. So the question that comes to Father Rodriguez is, does Christ love Kichijiro? The way Shusaku Endo, I keep mispronouncing his name is Shusaku Endo, explores this question is from the context of, did Christ love Judas? As he's facing the suffering, Father Rodriguez is trying to identify himself with the suffering of Christ in order to find courage. Just as Christ was betrayed by Judas, Father Rodriguez is betrayed by Kichijiro. And how should Father Rodriguez's loving response to Kichijiro be? It's not just that he's betrayed Father Rodriguez, he's betrayed a number of other Christians as well, who've had to face death. That becomes the deeper question of what is the fundamental nature of love. Is love something that is worthy of the powerful, of the strong, of those who are willing to put up with any suffering in the face of difficulties? Or is love something that accepts weakness of broken people? Father Rodriguez is angry at Kichijiro. Father Rodriguez finds himself unable to think about loving Kichijiro. And the question of why did Christ tell Judas, whatever you want to do it quickly, keeps coming back into Father Rodriguez's mind as he's going through this meditation of the Gospels on the one hand, and he sees Kichijiro being the external symbol of the betrayal of Christ and the betrayal of Father Rodriguez as well. The whole story becomes a journey in which Father Rodriguez realizes that the love of Christ is not just love for strong people, but the love of Christ is precisely for the weak. The love of Christ is precisely for people like Judas who betray him. The love of Christ is precisely for people like Kichijiro who betray him. For Father Rodriguez to realize this, he has to be able to empathize with Kichijiro. How does he do that? It happens only when Father Rodriguez realizes that his indignation for Kichijiro and even for Father Ferreira, who apostatized, came from a place of his own self-importance. It is only when he faces that dark side that a lot of what he had been doing as a father, as a minister of Christ, was coming from a place of self-importance. And in spite of that, he was loved by Christ, that he realizes that the love of Christ has a whole deep level of loving people that are weak. And in that sense, every human being is weak. And it is in the weakness that the love of Christ is most powerfully manifested. And the journey that Father Rodriguez goes through is a journey of him realizing that deep love of Christ. As I said in the beginning, I can see why Scorsese was attracted to this book. And even as I read this book was deeply helpful for me. Because as I go through suffering in my own life, the one thing that I find that helps me is that I meditate on the suffering of Christ. In fact, when I go through phases in my life that are tough, I would wake up in the morning and the first thing I would do would be to meditate on Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Read through the scripture passages and think about that and think about how Christ suffered for me. Because it is that meditation, it is that contemplation on Christ, on the countenance of Christ, on the face of Christ, that gives me the strength to push through the pain. And at the end of the book, what Father Rodriguez realizes is, though God is silent, or God seems to be silent, we hear him through all the voices that come to us from nature. But more importantly, his suffering presence is always with us. When Jürgen Moltmann wrote the book The Crucified Christ, The Crucified God, in which he explores the theme of Christ's crucifixion, he says, Christ's suffering on the cross is not just to forgive our sins. That is a key part of that. But it is also a partaking of human suffering. That when we suffer, the presence of Christ suffers along with us. That is what Christ does to us. God is not silent. We hear him if we would listen. When we suffer, we feel him suffering alongside us. Because as Bonhoeffer said, it is only a suffering God who can love. And silence is a journey that Father Rodriguez has to go through in order to realize this truth, that it is only through suffering that true love comes. And that is why the death of Christ on the cross is the central theme in Christianity. When I eventually see the movie, I'll do another review, possibly comparing the book and the movie, to see how much of these philosophical issues get explored in the movie. So, until I see you next time, bye.